All right. Hello and welcome back to the Bearded D20 channel. It's been forever since I've uploaded anything or made any videos, but I've been in the lab, so to speak, working on this. This is a hack or an alternate version of the One Ring second edition. I really got inspired by how that system handles its checks and its mechanical resolution. So over on the left, I'm going to go over what the base game is, why I'm making these changes, what the changes are, the core mechanic, and then just going through all these other topics here. So the by default, the normal One Ring second edition, I would classify it as a 1d12 why is my point? It's a 1d12 plus xd6 system. And what this means is you have a stat rating. So you have three stats in the One Ring. Those stats are strength, heart, and wits. And what they do is you have a stat rating. So say your stat rating of strength is 5. You take 20 minus your rating, and that gives you your success value. And on 1d12 plus xd6, you need about 3d6 in order to have basically a 50% chance to win on getting a 15 or higher if your strength was 5. Now, I know there's a variant rule where you can do 18 minus the rating, but neither here nor there. I've always been a little hesitant to 3-stat systems because I feel like it doesn't always give enough depth to a game, but after reading through Mythic Bastion Lands and the One Ring second edition, I just think until now they've just been caged inside of simpler systems, and these designers have sort of figured out a way to make those 3 stats breathe in a lot of ways. So let's get on to the why. I want magic. So there's no magic in the One Ring second edition. You might be thinking, what about Gandalf? Well, Gandalf was a superhero, basically. Most people in Middle-earth do not have magic. So Tolkien's Middle-earth is a very, very low magic world. And I think the base system works really well for importing it, and we'll get to that later. But this is the main why. I wanted magic. This was the one change that I wanted to make. And then a whole bunch of other changes sort of cascaded from this as little things that I didn't like how the base system did it, that I kept changing. So there's a lot of changes, but I'd say the biggest one, well, there's a lot of big ones. And aside from adding magic, I have introduced my own version of Vantage and Disadvantage. Now what these do in this system is they change your d6s. So Advantage makes a d6 into a d8, and it also makes a d6 into a d4. Advantage and disadvantage cancel out. If you get to the point where all of your d6s have turned into d8s, then any extra advantage continues stacking, and you get new d6s, and then those turn into d8s, and you get another d6, and that turns into a d8, so on and so forth, until you finally run out of stacked advantage. Stacked disadvantage will eventually reach a hard limit, but if it does, you're most likely not going to succeed the check anyways. The way stacking disadvantage works, it turns all of your d6s into d4s one at a time, and then if you have a d4, you still have leftover disadvantage, it starts removing those from your roll till all you have left is the d12. And at that point, I think if you remember what I said about stat ratings and your stats up here, you're likely not going to pass checks alone by just the dice roll alone. There are ways to do it with the resource system that I'll get to later, but it's not a situation you want to find yourself in. So this is still a 1d12 plus xd6 roll high system. I guess I'll also put binary pass fail. So there is a way to do degrees of success in this, but it's not in the core mechanic, at least not for the success pass fail. So if you meet or beat your success value, the One Ring calls them target numbers or TNs. If you meet or beat that, you pass the check. If you roll under, you fail. The changes that I've made, the intention is that you never fail a check. That might sound weird, but the entire system is sort of designed to grind your resources into dust over the course of your plan. And the game is more of a resource management exercise than anything else. I have changed the stats to physique, perception, and persona. This just fits better with a more generic setting. Strength, heart, and wits is perfect for the One Ring. I wouldn't change that at all for the base game, but for a more generalized setting, basically body, mind, and soul. Just all P's because I thought it was funny. Anyways, so we have here, we'll just make it. In these boxes. There we go. All right. So stat rating, stat success, and stat resources. All right, so the stat rating, as I described over here, it's a value in this system. It's most likely going to range between 4 and 8, but 8 is going to be hard to get. Because I don't actually want the math to be in your favor to pass checks without spending resources. That's sort of, I want it to happen occasionally, but I don't want the odds to be overwhelmingly in the player's favor in terms of that, because there's so many ways for you to pass your check through spending. If you just get a free lunch, then that doesn't really accomplish the goal of what I'm trying to do with the system. And if anyone's recoiling at that, I just ask you, think about your own life, and if you've ever accomplished anything on a regular basis without some sort of resource expenditure from yourself, whether that's your time, your money, your stress, your attention span. Like, everything has a cost associated with this. That's why we eat and take breaks and recharge, and it's sort of what I want to capture here. And I guess by the end of this, you can decide if you find that engaging. So just like with the base One Ring, we take the stat rating, we subtract 20 to get our stat success. and then we take our stat rating times 5 to get that stat's specific resource. And the resources, we have endurance for physique, focus for perception, and gravitas for persona. For when you, in general, when you take damage, you're using your body sort of reacts to danger automatically. So damage in this system is how much endurance you lose to that attack. But it doesn't always have to be damage per se from a weapon. It could be one of the goals of this system is to treat every single encounter where you're rolling dice exactly the same with no difference. There shouldn't be any difference between climbing a mountain and fighting a group of goblins. The system should process both of those things the same. And since all of the rolls, this is another change I forgot to mention, every roll in the system is player facing. The GM never rolls dice for anything. You could tweak it, I think, without too much work to make it an opposed system, because all of the values are sort of based on the dice. So I think if that's something people really don't want player focus for whatever reason, I think I could revert this to a opposed system or opposed dice roll, which the base game isn't opposed, it's back and forth. The regular, the One Ring, has a traditional, I make a check against your AC or parry value, and vice versa, back and forth. And one of the problems with the One Ring is the success value doesn't change except for parry. Randomly, the parry value is gets modified in combat, which is, it definitely works. It's not a deal breaker on the system, but it's inelegant. And I've heard other people complain about that aspect of it. Anyways, back to stats. Endurance is what you lose in any sort of encounter where you're preventing yourself from taking bodily harm. So with our rock climbing example, if you're making an athletics proficiency check, and depending on the roll, it may be treated, depending on if it's a proactive or a reactive roll. Since every roll is player facing, proactive rolls where the player's trying to do something against the world, either attack the goblin, climb the mountain. You don't suffer any penalties if you, how do I put it? Your proactive roll can't be used against you to do you damage. A failure in that case, depending on the dice, would just be you not making as much progress. Or the GM could offer, we could get into resources, the GM could offer to bargain with threat as to not bog the game down, because we don't want players just getting stuck on a mountain because you failed a climb check. That's boring. Use the bargain with threat mechanic, give the GM a threat, pass the check, and move on. Or you could spend other resources, but we'll get to these in a second. So, but on the flip side, if I spend a threat to make the mountain, quote unquote, attack the player the same way that a goblin would attack them, they would make a reactive check, and they can use whatever skill is the most logical. Endurance being, or not endurance, athletics being the most logical proficiency to use, but I could also see an argument for something like labor. If you're just going to say, I use brute force to just cling to this mountain like glue, labor check, I could buy that. And the further and further away from the most logical proficiency you can impose disadvantage on those if players really want to roll something that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Just throw a bunch of disadvantage of it. So then, based on their check, the attack of the mountain would drain their endurance, and that would represent rocks falling, loose fittings, maybe it's slippery, maybe it's snowy or wet, whatever. Nature fights back. So your endurance, once that drops below your load, so all the junk you're carrying, then you become weary. And that's one thing. The condition I share with the original game, but its effect is different because we're using different sided dice depending on our advantage and disadvantage state, which is going to be pretty common in the game to have some of either. In the base game, Weary makes it so that your d6s, 1, 2s, and 3s don't count. In this game, Weary prevents you from recovering from stagger. Every time your character is forced to make a reactive check, and it's not something hand wavy like a social encounter that just kind of comes and goes. If you're in a prolonged, well, I shouldn't say it that way. Technically, every time you make a reactive check, you gain stagger. Depending on the situation, I think players are going to know whether or not it's worth keeping track of that stagger or not. Because you also recover 1 stagger on your turn as long as you're not weary. So once you become weary, then it's hard to kind of regain your composure. And that is just to represent how prolonged, physically stressful situations continuously sort of catch you off balance. And stagger is important because in the default One Ring, if you roll a Gandalf rune, you trigger an armor-piercing attack. It's a critical hit, basically. So in my system, I'm just calling a natural 12 a crit, but a lot of the goal of this system is to crit as much as possible. Because draining your target's endurance is cool, but in a combat situation, you could imagine you have a fighter with a sword, you attack a goblin, and you don't crit the goblin, but you do get a success. You're going to drain endurance from the goblin. So the goblin, like if the goblin didn't have a way to defend itself, your attack would have probably killed it, but it does. So you just drained its endurance for it to deflect the attack. Every point of stagger that goblin has increases the threat range on the d12 that a crit is going to occur. So if it only has 1, then you crit on an 11 or higher. If it is 3, you crit on a 10 or higher, so on and so forth. And there's also, you might also have a mechanic on your character that just increases your threat range that's independent of stagger, so that could also widen that crit range out as well. So then we get to I guess we'll finish off the crit thing. Most things only have 1 wound. Once you wound something, you're going to roll the d6 pool for the armor penetration value of your attack against the defense that you're targeting. Since I didn't have anything for defenses on here real quick, you have 4 defenses. You have armor, 4 weapons, oh, not physique. You have armor for weapon attacks or anything that's similar to a weapon attack. If someone throws a rock at you, that's still going to be armor. If a stalactite falls in a cave and is coming at you, that's also probably going to be armor. Physical is for things that affect your body in a way that armor is not going to protect you from, such as poison, diseases, things like that. Displacement effects. If something tries to move you against your will, armor will stop you from getting injured by that. But if you're being blown away by a powerful gust, that's going to be physical. That's your body's defense. Energy is things that your character, is the way to put it, if you're getting scorched by fire, regular armor isn't really going to protect you from intense heat, nor is it going to protect you from intense cold or electricity. Physical isn't really going to protect you from those things either. You know, you can have the person with the strongest immune system in the entire world, and if they're exposed to intense energy, it's not going to make a single bit of difference in how wounded they can get. So energy is its own thing. And then mental, if anything tries to mess with your mind or change how your character acts, that's mental. And this functions pretty similar to the base game. The base game doesn't have all these extra defenses. I added them because they make sense to me, and I like to have different vectors to deal with in my game. And since we're adding magic, I feel like we need these extra vectors. The One Ring doesn't really need them because it's just more of a medieval style combat sim. So when you hit something, or you are hit, we'll do the PC hurting NPC first. Your weapon or spell or whatever you're doing is going to have a certain number of d6s associated with it. It's the penetration value of that attack. You're going to roll that, compare it against the target's defense score of that particular defense you're targeting. If you beat that value, you wound the target. This might also, the wound might not be a wound, depending on what exactly you're doing. For instance, if you're trying to trap a group of goblins in a big mud pit, critting them prevents them from moving out and they get stuck in the mud pit. It doesn't wound them because it doesn't make sense. And that's one thing that players and GMs will kind of have to adjudicate on the fly as to what a character is doing is actually lethal or non-lethal. And I'll try to come up with more guidance on that. But it is the type of system where I want a lot of modular mechanical systems to basically plug in whenever something happens that you're not exactly sure, because there isn't an explicit rule for certain things. For example, there's not going to be an explicit rule for what happens if a character decides to use their torch to attack a monster, because that's what they have in their hand at the time, and something surprises them and they have a torch in their hand. So they're going to hit the thing with the torch. Well, torch is probably the most similar to a club, so I would say that it is a weapon proficiency club check, meaning the player, even though we haven't gotten to proficiency yet, we're basically there now. When you're making a weapon proficiency check, you get to pick one of your physique proficiencies and add that dice to the pool. So if we have swords, clubs, forearms, chain, and marksman. And then let's go to our proficiencies here for physique. Athletics, labor, instinct, survival, perform, and aura. And this ties into action influences narrative. So these blend together as well. So I think the most obvious combination is going to be athletics and labor in terms of adding these proficiencies to your pool. I don't think anyone really has too much of a problem with that, but there's no rule that says any of these things are prohibited from being combined with any weapon. Because if somebody is good ranks in instinct and they make a marksman, they have good marksman and they're making a ranged attack with a projectile weapon, and they just say I want to use my instinct because it makes sense, or I want to use survival because my character is good at survival and survival could be used for hunting. So I don't see, if I can hunt a deer, why can't I hunt the enemy, quote unquote? And I don't see a problem with this. All of these proficiencies are extremely useful in their own utility function. Allowing them to be used in the combat check just allows characters to express themselves in that way. Athletics is kind of your typical running, jumping, swimming, climbing. Gambit. Labor is more raw strength. You could also kind of use it as a measure of doing something that's very energy intensive and repetitive and being successful. Instinct might catch people off guard. They're saying, why would instinct be in physique? Well, I think your overall physical fitness does play a pretty big role in your kind of general, instant awareness, instant ability to react to things. Instinct is an awareness type skill or an awareness proficiency, but it is not the type of thing you'd use to find a secret door. It's the type of thing where if there's something dangerous in the immediate vicinity or closing in on you, and the GM tells you to make a reaction roll, and you want to roll that reaction with instinct to avoid it or detect it at the last minute, that is what instinct is for. It's those split second, you sense something, you're not sure why, your body's telling you something, but your mind has yet to fully process what you're being told other than danger. And we have survival. And I think, once again, your physical fitness definitely plays into how well you're able to survive. And the general assumption with a game like this is that the knowledge, per se, of how to survive isn't exactly, it's not something that people would be unaware of. So it would more just be your actual proficiency in doing the thing. We have perform. Once again, your physical in a 3-stat system, your physique has a huge impact on how well you're able to actually perform. You can know or feel something with your other stats, but actually doing it is perform. And this, in the base One Ring, it's just song. I just changed it to perform because any type of performance that's going to involve your body is going to map to this. So it could be singing. Singing does have a huge impact on your physique, does have a huge impact on your ability to sing. Dancing, whatever it is. Aura. I thought about naming this presence, but there is overlap with that, so I left this as aura. And this is literally just when people, how people say first impressions are the most important, aura is how you carry yourself when you meet new people. And so you could think of aura as a way to inspire people or intimidate people, and it's purely a visual thing. If you're talking to people or trying to motivate them by saying something, that's going to be a different proficiency. But aura is just how you're doing something. People see you being awesome, or your enemies see what you're doing and are terrified. That's aura. All right, now that we've gone through these, I guess we could circle back to the combat thing, because combat the way you build your dice pool changes, but how the game functions in terms of making checks and turn order doesn't really change. So we're making a swords, so we have a 2 rating in swords and we have a 2 rating in athletics. We can combine those for a D pool, a D6 pool of 6 or 4d6. So that'll give us a pretty good chance of success, kind of regardless of whatever our stat rating is. And that is because enemies are going to be imposing disadvantage on your attack checks constantly. And this is something I realized pretty early on, is that your attack pool, it kind of has to be bigger than when you're making a non-combat type check. So even though I don't really want a dedicated combat mode, non-combat mode, the act of fighting sort of requires the dice pools themselves be built so that your combat pools are bigger. Because every single proficiency rating your opponent has to defend themselves is a disadvantage for you, because this is a player only rolls. And you're rolling against your own success stat if you hit someone. So the only way to represent your opponent's ability to defend themselves is to impose a bunch of disadvantage on you based on how skilled they are. And it's just kind of a one-to-one thing. So if the opponent you were attacking, let's say it's an orc this time, we'll give the goblins a break. And the orc has a polearm, and we'll say that they're good in labor. So they have, let's say they have 1 point in labor and 2 points in polearms. So that'd be 3 points total for their defense pool. And you might be wondering why I'm using their weapon skill for defense. And it's just because this goes back to, I want people to describe what they're doing in the game, sort of like PBTA. I don't want it to just be oh, I'm rolling my defense stat. No, how are you defending yourself? How are you protecting yourself from this threat that's coming at you? And so the orc is using the polearm they have in their hand, their spear, and they're using their brute strength, their labor, to parry the sword attack or deflect the sword attack away from them. So that's their described defense. I see nothing wrong with this description in the slightest. So let's roll it. And in this case, it's opposed. So that pool of 3 is going to impose 3 disadvantage on our sword attack. So then our pool goes from a pretty sweet 1d12 plus 46 with 3 disadvantage. It goes down to 1d12 plus 1d6 plus 3d4, which is still going to give us a pretty good chance of success. And I can calculate that on any dice right now. Let's see here. So let's do first with 46. I know it's not being streamed, but that's okay. 1d12 plus 46. All right. If our rating was 5, just kind of the average, that puts 5 way down the bell curve. I don't know if I have a way to quickly calculate this. Let's see here. Let's see. All right. Well, I started this, so I might as well see the calculation through to the end. So 68, so I know this is a quick calculation, but you're already up to, so with that example, it's basically a 68% chance. Let me see if I can do this faster. All right, so back after calculating this stuff. Okay, so we go from an 88% chance of success down to a 73. And that's just because our pool was big. 2 plus 2, 46 is a huge pool. At the beginning of the game, you may have a 2 in one of these, but on average, it's probably just going to be one dice in some of these, not even a one dice in all of them. And there's some specific rules about spears that would also impose more disadvantage, but I don't want to get too sidetracked right now. I'm just giving a bare bones basic example of how this works. But just know that in the full rules with the nuances, the different weapons, this disadvantage would be higher. But anyways, I think you can see how this works. Just move these out of the way for now. Way out of the way. Okay. So if we roll lower than a 12, but we succeed, then we'll do our sword's damage to the orc's endurance. If that pushes the orc under its load, then it'll be wearied and won't be able to recover from stagger. But as it stands now, if the orc's fresh, no, that'll just inflict one stagger upon it, and then on its turn it will recover. So you can gang up on a single target, even if it's not weary, to stack additional stagger on top of single targets. And it's for this reason why I don't have any sort of flanking bonus in the game, because I don't think it needs it. Because if you're constantly attacking a target, you're building up a lot of stagger. And since a D12 has a way better chance to get a single facing than a D20, every single point of stagger, you're drastically increasing your crit chance on triggering an armor piercing roll on the target. And that's just as a before, it's a d6 pool from your weapon versus the defense value of the target based on the defense you're targeting with whatever you're doing. There are cases where a target will have too much armor for you to penetrate, and in that situation, and this is something I'm open to changing, Right now, what I have it is that when your endurance hits 0 in the base 1 ring, you become wounded and you're out of the fight. I decided to change it so that when you hit 0, every single extra point of damage you would take translates immediately into raw bonus stagger. And that's just, you're completely exhausted, and even a tiny hit in that state just you're just completely unable to protect your vitals, increasing the chance of a crit by an insane amount. If you reach 11 stagger to the point where anything that rolls against you would crit, then you become incapacitated. You're just completely exhausted, you're knocked out, and then incapacitated creatures or targets, you can kind of do whatever you want to do with them. So if you want to coup de grace them at that point, you can. If you want to capture people, and I think that's why I didn't have it become an automatic wound when you're out of endurance. Because it is possible just to become so exhausted that you just collapse. You're not wounded in that state, at least not yet. So if you're trying to capture somebody, then not using a high penetration weapon would actually be your goal, to just beat them until the point they take so much damage they reach 12 or they reach 11 stagger, and then they just become incapacitated, and then you tie them or whatever else you want to do. All right. I'll quickly go over perception. We have mechanical, alchemical, study, navigate, stealth, and investigate. Open to possibly changing some of these, but I think it covers the gambit of perception being your attention to detail, which mechanical and alchemical require that. Your ability to study, when it goes again, that kind of is your ability to focus in on something and extract information from it over a prolonged period of time. Navigate, again, I think that goes into kind of the whole detail oriented, but also using your senses to figure out where you are and get where you need to go. Stealth, I think, definitely belongs here because you can't be stealthy if you're not aware of your surroundings. And then investigate, this is your kind of default perception check, if you will. If you want to investigate something, that's more of a quick action than study. Study is really geared towards learning something over a long period of time. Let's see. And then for persona, all right, some of these might catch people off guard why they're here, but I decided to put medical in persona because in this particular age of medicine, persona, you could think of medical is like first aid. If you're treating someone over a long period of time, you're probably going to use alchemical, because I'm going in that situation. I would assume you're using your alchemical proficiency to brew medicine for them. But if you're treating a wound, that is a different skill set than being able to make medicine. And I could easily see, and I'm sure there's people out there where you could have a pharmacologist who is afraid of blood and can't stand even looking at someone who's injured, but could brew or create a miraculous drug which cures people of complex ailments. Whereas medical is more big gash, broken bone. This is your first aid, your instant fix all is here. And then artisan, any type of detailed work that sort of expresses your personality is going to be artisan. So artisan could be creating a custom table, you might say, oh, that's mechanical. Well, yes, but no. If you used mechanical to make a table, I would assume it would be more utilitarian, whereas artisan, you have a flair on it. And then artisan is also for any type of work that sort of expresses yourself, painting, whatnot, poetry. Insight is typically going to be your reaction check to social situations where there are undercurrents and innuendos going on. The GM wants you to see if your character can pick up on them or not. It's going to be your lie detector or omission detector for dealing with NPCs. Sway, generally used in an active sense to convince people to see things your way. And then morale is phrased this way because it is intimidate, but it's also inspire. And I don't think those things need a separate proficiency. I think people that are good at scaring creatures or scaring people are also going to know what motivates people and gives them the motivation to keep going. And morale is the spoken version of aura. So if you're doing an action, it's aura. If you're saying something, then it's persona or morale. And then myth is here. Myth is basically a lore proficiency. And it's in persona because myth is all about the spoken stories that bards sing at taverns, or stories that you hear people talking about in the tavern on their own after they've had a few beers in them. And so myth is just to see if you have been social enough, or rather your ability to kind of absorb random bits of hearsay. You could also use myth to sort of spread rumors about someone if you wanted to, if you were playing in more of a, I don't know, espionage type situation. All right, and we get to actions influence narrative. The idea is that at least for athletics and all of the proficiencies, the idea is that when you make a check, the skill you're using, when you get a 6 or higher, that you can sort of use that in a way that helps you, that's not a crit. And some examples of that will bring swords and the physique proficiencies down here. So for all weapons, they can power attack. And that translates to spending a 6+ on power attacking. So in this example up here, we have 1d12 plus 46. Any 6 that we get in this pool, it doesn't subtract from the roll. I'll just put percent. So anyone looking at this isn't confused. This doesn't mean that it equals 88. It's just the percent chance of getting a 15 plus from a previous example. So we can spend these 6s on different things. And swords have their own traits that they can spend them on, so do clubs, pawns, whatever. But power attacking is universal across all weapons can power attack. And you spend a 6, and you do your physique rating as damage again. And I didn't bring it up before, but your weapons, you can wield a weapon up to your physique rating in terms of size. So if a weapon has a size rating of 5, you need at least 5 physique rating to pick that weapon up. If you pick up a weapon that's too big for you, then you suffer disadvantage per the size point difference, and I don't think gaining 1 point of damage is worth disadvantage. So you can do it if you want, but it's really not a good idea. It's too big for you. I think this creates a really interesting dynamic where characters with unusually low or unusually high physique ratings can go to a blacksmith and have a weapon custom made that is the right size for their character to wield. So you could also, in a GM, when you enter a blacksmith or a weapon shop, you could roll a couple dice and have different weapons of different sizes in the shop randomly generated. And since that rating, that size value, is the damage, so if you're wielding a size 6 sword, that's its base damage. Then there's different modifiers for if that sword is two-handed. There's different modifiers for specific types of weapons, like hammer. All hammers are clubs, but not all clubs are hammers. Hammers have special damage rules for them, and axes also fit into the club category. But anyways, so that's how damage works. So power attack, normally if you just get a success, but you don't have any 6s, and your physique rating was 5, and the weapon you're wielding was size 5, you'd just do 5 damage to the target's endurance. But if you had 2 6s in there, you could spend those and add plus 10 to that, 5 for each power attack. And that's where endurance really starts to drain when you start triggering these d6 rolls. And ultimately, if people take nothing else away from the game, if you didn't even worry about the specifics of any of these weapons, and you just kind of went off of vibes when making your checks, and you just pitched ideas for what you wanted to happen when you got a 6+ that was narratively appropriate, you would be playing sort of my idealized version of the game. The only reason I'm writing rules for specific weapon types and whatnot is to give more structure to the game in a shared vision of the game that everyone can sort of read and agree upon to play. But ideally, if you're playing in a home group and not playing in a larger community, I don't even care if people really use the specific rules for weapons. If you're rolling dice, getting 6s, and then just kicking people off ledges or tripping them or slashing them in such a way that their speed's reduced, as long as you can narratively describe it, you're playing the idealized version in my head. And there's so many combinations of things you can do in situations that it's impossible to record all that. So let's get to cooperation. Focus for yourself. Gravitas for your team. So when we calculated these resources earlier, it's your stat rating in them times 5. So in order to boost your chances of success and to get 6s for trigger rolls, you can spend focus points on a 1-to-1 basis to boost any d6, d4, or d8 you can boost the roll 1 point per focus spent. So if you roll a 4 on one of your d6s, you can spend 2 focus, make it a 6. That also increases your roll. So if you're at the edge of success and failure, you can spend some focus to make sure that you succeed. And that's you kind of mentally, as it says, focus. You're focusing to complete a task. You're digging into your mental concentration to achieve success. And also, you're turning these 4s into 6s, so we get trigger rolls and interesting things happen. And this is what I was saying, how the core dice roll is binary pass-fail, but it does have degrees of success. It's just that the degrees of success are non-linear, because how you spend your 6+ is up to you. Maybe you just spend them on power attacks, like in the previous example, but maybe it's more beneficial to do something different with it instead of just doing raw damage. Maybe you need to set up an ally to be more successful in the future. But I won't ramble on those. Gravitas, it does the exact same thing as focus, but only for your team. You can never spend gravitas on yourself, and just how focus, you can never spend focus on other people. So gravitas can boost dice of other people. There's no action, there's no reaction, there's no cost to using gravitas other than just spending it. So when a player is 2 points from success, if two people say, "Oh, I spend one gravitas. Let's turn that 4. I boost the 4 to a 5. Somebody else says I boost the 5 to a 6. They each spend one gravitas. Now their ally achieves success and they have a trigger roll to spend." And I want to stress that there should be no fiddling over gravitas. If a teammate spends gravitas and gives it to you, you can't give it back. They've already spent it. They've given you whatever they've given you. Most likely either you already had success or they gave you success, and you either had trigger rolls or they gave you more trigger rolls. You can't undo somebody's camaraderie or tactical coordination. That's what gravitas represents. It represents how tight-knit groups work together, they're coordinating, they're calling out things. Gravitas is a catch-all representation of that verbal and even non-verbal, like body language type communication that's going on between tight-knit groups of people. And in an adventuring setting like D&D, you're definitely going to be seeing people do that type of stuff. And that's how that works. Resource management. So you have your endurance to manage, your focus to manage, and your gravitas to manage. You also have your load. And as we touched on with endurance, load's how much junk you're carrying. You can carry kind of as much load as you want. There's no weight limit, but there are some rules for what happens when your load exceeds your endurance. So temporarily, if you need to carry a bunch of stuff and your load exceeds your endurance, you'll become weary, so you won't be able to recover from stagger if something bad happens. But you can move with that. You cannot go on a journey, however, if you are weary. And since a lot of the game is about long distance overland travel, you're basically stuck wherever you're at if you're trying to carry too much junk. So you have this to manage. The other thing about load being in reference to endurance is it allows itemization in a way that I've never really seen in a game. Like in Pathfinder 2, they had to come up with 10 light items equaling 1 bulk, which is fine. But it is a lot of bookkeeping to keep track of 0.1 load items. And in this system, because load can be much higher than it is in other games, it's very easy to just say 1 use of an adventuring kit is 1 load. 1 use of medical supplies, 1 load. 1 use of a repair kit to repair armor or repair weapons, 1 load. So you can just itemize every sort of resource interaction that a party would make with their own inventory as a 1 load expenditure. And then it's pretty easy to come up with coin monetary exchange rates to replenish those load charges, if you will, back into your inventory. And that sort of brings us to 2 other notes about load. I do want load to be organized by container. And that just means, how is your load distributed? Is all of your consumable stuff in a backpack? And the reason why that matters is mainly, Well, there's a mechanical reason and a narrative reason. Narratively, on your turn, you can spend 2 points of movement if you're playing with grid-based movement. That's movement, and distance is a whole other topic, but suffice to say, I think the bones of the system work no matter what sort of format you're in. If you want to play this in a grid system, it'll work. If you want to play it with zones, it'll work. And if you just want to do theater of the mind, it will also work. Because the bones of this, none of this stuff matters in terms of the grid. So I'm not too worried about that. But it spends movement to drop a single item or container of smaller items on your turn. And you will want to do this in order to remove the weary condition from yourself as your endurance drops, so you can continue to recover from stagger. Because you don't want your crit rate, or your crit rate against you, to keep going up. So if you have a helmet, you can drop it. It's like one of my favorite rules from the One Ring. Taking off your helmet reduces your load. It reduces your armor, but honestly, losing 1d6 armor to be able to recover from stagger so you don't have to make the armor check in the first place is probably the smart move, but time will tell, I suppose. Either way, it's just a badass thing to do, so why wouldn't you take off your helmet? But dropping a backpack would also be something in that vein. And the downside of dropping your backpack is now all of your consumables and stuff you have in it are on the ground and you can't use them. The benefit is that it drops a lot of load all at once. And so you can decide if you want, some players might have like a bandolier or a belt, and they may choose to decide to put, well, I'm going to put 3 load worth of potions on my belt, and I'm going to put one load. I'm going to put an alchemist fire, like a frost fire flask, and a thunderstone. I'm going to put that in my bandolier. So I have 6 load of little consumables on me, that if I drop my backpack with like my medical supplies and my repair kits and my adventuring tools that I don't need right this second, I can drop that, let's say 9 load worth of miscellaneous consumables in my backpack on the ground. And I think that's really cool. I like having decisions in how my character carries gear, but having that matter in a mechanical way. The other resource you're going to have is the advantage pool. And so the advantage pool is the game's way of measuring your so you can get bonus advantage from the advantage pool. This is a way of representing well rested. So when you go back to town and you eat a really good meal, you stay in a really good inn, or you have your own house even, you go to a sauna, you get a massage, you go see, Wanderlust, the play. Fantastic arrangement by a world famous bard. All these things are examples of things that are going to boost your advantage pool for the next time you go out on an adventure. And your advantage pool, it's a good way to boost proficiencies that you're not great at. And the advantage pool is kind of be your bread and butter for non-combat checks, at least early in the game, since most of your regular proficiencies are going to be 0s, 1s, maybe a 2, and really you want 3d6 for a decent chance. So when you're attempting something that you're not particularly great at passing on the fly, you're going to spend some advantage pool, and you're probably also going to have to spend some focus, or your team's going to have to pitch in some gravitas. Because I don't want it should not be assumed that adventuring over untamed wilderness and navigating through old dungeons is easy. It's not easy. And games like D&D and Pathfinder don't really represent just how exhausting and mentally taxing doing stuff like this actually is. But I want to make the resources plentiful so that you can actually get to where you're going and you still have advantage pool left, you still have focus and gravitas left, and because you're going to need that in order to burn through to explore the dungeon you're going to, or participate in whatever adventure. You can use the dungeon as a metaphor. It doesn't have to be a literal dungeon, obviously. This is something I don't really have a lot of rules for yet in terms of what specific service or good gives you X amount of advantage pool. I just know that this mechanic, it's in the game. It will be in the game. Advantage pool is not something you can recover focus and gravitas and endurance traveling through items. Advantage pool, you will have a hard time recovering dice for. You really need your big juicy advantage pool is going to come from being in the town and spending money to recover it. You could, I mean, there's different ways you could look at the advantage pool. It's basically an exhaustion meter, because you're supposed to burn this to boost your checks so you actually pass them, or have a good baseline for passing them. So you're not spending like 6 focus to pass a check. You're spending 1 advantage dice, and then you may be spending 2 focus and some gravitas. Let's get to turn order. Turn order. So we have freeform versus structured play. Move this out of the way. So the game is assumed by default to be in freeform play. The minute anybody makes a check for any reason, whether it's a proactive or reactive check, the game instantly is in structured play until that check is fully resolved. And this is just an automatic thing. I'm just defining it so that mainly the GM knows that the check that's being rolled and adjudicated has to be fully resolved before anybody else can do anything, with the exception of, adding gravitas. And there can definitely be reactions to what's going on, but that will just be a continuation of structured play. Structured play persists as long as checks are being made. So you're in structured. Once a check is made, it's resolved. If there is a follow-up check, then you're still in structured play, and you just keep staying in structured until there are no more checks to be rolled. Then you automatically go back to freeform, and you keep going. And this is what I was saying earlier, is how there's no combat mode. There's just freeform and structured play. There's no carve out specifically for combat. Combat is just a subtype of structured play. But it's the same. Anything that's worth rolling for is structured play. And combat's worth rolling for. But so is climbing a mountain. So is descending into a dark hole with a tattered piece of rope. That's also dangerous. And that would be structured play. And the turn order matters. So, and we're stealing a bit of Daggerheart here. So I like the spotlight system from Daggerheart, but I don't like how it hinges on 2 different dice, because this might sound very nitpicky, but it makes it very hard to actually play Daggerheart online, because you have to use a bot to roll dice in such a way that you can tell which is hope and which is fear. And the easiest way is to find a bot that always rolls dice in order rolled and doesn't rank order them from highest to lowest. These are just like little friction points that make Daggerheart annoying. But the point is it's a 50-50 chance. And even and odd, theoretically, should also just be a 50-50 chance. So on an even result, this is the total result rolled. And it's mainly that way just for simplicity. Because now I'll give you an alternative to this if you're playing with physical dice. But the reason why I say it's the total roll is because I mostly play online. And I want to keep that in mind for this. Because most roll bots are going to automatically add all dice rolled together. And this just keeps it very easy. So you can just look at what the robot has spitted out. If it's even, the players maintain control of the situation, and the player who just finished their check can call out the next player to make their check. If the final result is odd, then the GM gets to decide if they want to force a player to make a check. And that basically stays the same no matter what you're doing. As I said, there's no combat mode, just structured play. So in the rock climbing event, if you made a rock climbing check and you success, but you rolled odd, then the GM could force maybe somebody else or you to make a reaction roll because you just triggered the GM can do something. And it's the same in combat. If you rolled a success, but you rolled odd, well, now the GM can have one of the NPCs do something against you and force somebody to make a defensive reaction check against them. If it's even, you call out somebody else and they go, and so on and so forth. There is one caveat to this system, because extreme bouts of unluck or luck can occur, and you could get a whole bunch of even or a whole bunch of odd numbers, as unlikely as it is, in a row. And that's why I decided to put in a rule called auto switch. If you're in a situation where you have this prolonged streak of luck, of bad luck or good luck, after, in the case of the PCs, after every PC is gone, you're taking one action, and you still roll even, then it automatically switches to the GM regardless of that. Likewise, if the GM continues to roll odd, and they have rolled odd a number of times in a row equal to the player count, and they roll odd again, then it switches back to the players. But it only switches back to them for one roll. It doesn't give them a full suite. It just, there is a bit of lenience, and then ideally luck should swing it back. So I guess that's just something I'll have to think about in playtesting, but well, anyways, we'll see how that works. All right. Free form magic. My favorite part. So just as with everything else in this game, it's just a check versus success, and then you use 6 pluses to do cool things. Magic is no exception. There's no long list of spells in the game. It's just a check, like anything else. But magic does work on its own, a little bit of its own rules in one sense, and that you have magic forms. So you have create, perceive, change, destroy, and control. And these forms here, by themselves, they can't do anything, which is why you have to combine them with an actual spell. I have no idea why that's so big. Okay, so for perception-based magic, we have your pretty standard. Perception magic has fire, water, earth, air, and arcana. And arcana just kind of being catch-all for raw, unmanipulated magic. You know, once arcana has been manipulated, then it turns into another type of magic. And for persona, we have animal, plant, mortal, mentalist, and soul. So what we can do with this, if we want to create fire, we would take our proficiency rank in create, add it to the dice pool for proficiency rank with fire. That'd give us our magic pool of dice. Just like how for weapons, you pick one of the athletics proficiencies and add it to your weapon that you're making the check with. Magic's the same way. And then the trick to this is to just have enough modular mechanical support to facilitate whatever you want to do when you get a 6 plus, because that's really the 6 pluses are kind of where your creativity can really shine with magic. By default, magic, you can just treat it as a weapon. So just as if it was a regular weapon, it just targets a different defense depending on what you're doing. So to give you a quick example, create fire. If we were to create fire on a target, we're basically just lighting them on fire. You're not throwing fire at them, you're just literally creating fire where they're standing, igniting them. So base, this would do whatever our perception rating was as damage to endurance. Since fire is, it's an energy effect, but you're harming somebody, and it takes endurance to sort of avoid getting wounded by the fire. And this is what I was referring to earlier, and how GMs are going to have to adjudicate a bit the translating the narrative effect of a spell into an actual mechanical consequence. Because it doesn't make sense for fire to do damage to focus or gravitas. It makes the most sense that it goes to endurance because fire can kill you. So if fire can kill you by harming your body, then it goes to endurance. And those are kind of the questions you have to think through. Now, if we rolled a crit and we wounded the target, what defense would this go against? So the penetration check, like how for weapons it's based on the weapon itself, for magic it's your d6 pool. So if we had 1 in create and 2 in fire, our penetration for fire would be 3d6, and fire is energy, so we would be rolling against the target's energy defense, or vice versa. We'd be rolling our energy defense versus the NPC's like static penetration value. Water, if you did, let's see, control water on a target, you could say that you're condensing the water or pulling water out of the air, and you're trying to suffocate the target with a little water bubble on their face. Pretty morbid, but that's the type of creativity I kind of want to see when people are playing this. And what would that look like? Well, you're exhausting the person, so once again, this would do your perception rating as damage to their endurance. And this would go against, if you wounded them, since you can drown from water, that would be physical, because that's an internal thing. Armor has no effect on it. It's not energy, because you're not changing the temperature or literally electrocuting them, so it's physical. Just like how, your lung capacity, your ability to withstand drowning would be something your physical d6 pool would help protect you against in that case. If we did air and we were to try to push somebody around, I would say that that'd have to come from d6s. So let's talk about d6s real quick for these examples. If we were to light someone on fire, a 6 could be used to inflict the burning condition on the target. And as with every attack, you could power attack. So you could power attack with fire and burn more of their endurance, but lighting them on fire is also going to be good. Water. If you got a 6 for water, I almost feel like that would be an argument for using the same types of rules that piercing weapons have to increase the threat range on your D12 to make an actual check to see if they're wounded or not. So it's the type of thing where if you have a big pool of dice, D6s, it could be good to try to open with that, but it'd be very effective to use against targets that already have a lot of stagger. So the crit range on them is expanding in your favor, and then you also have the D6 pool to further expand it to trigger the crit. Earth, the most easiest thing to think of with Earth is you can create weapons out of it. So if you were to create Earth and you want to say you create like a sword out of thin air, you could also use change Earth or control Earth to create a weapon, and then the penetration value would just be whatever that magic pool was. And once again, it would have damage based on your perception rating. You know, your ability to conceptualize the magic is how deadly that weapon is. So mages can definitely create weapons. If you were to create an actual weapon, then you would use your weapon skills for it. But if you were to create a weapon and then use control to actually manipulate it remotely, then I would say you just keep using your control ability. So you could see a situation where you create fire and then control fire, and then you use the fire that you created to attack other targets. Let's see. I won't go through all of these, but I will make a special point about, so animal, plant, and mortal. Yeah, T. Animal, plant, and mortal are here. So if you do things like create mortal, you're not literally creating a new person. I would say that that is healing, or a type of healing magic, just as destroy mortal is basically negative energy from a cleric. So the only difference is just that you would need different ranks in animal, plant, and mortal in order to either heal or destroy them. Let's see. And then perceive. Perceive can also extend to communication or gathering information from something. So perceive arcana is your detect magic. Perceive mortal is basically like a detect human or detect mortal, because it extends to all like humanoid-ish, you know, mortal races. Perceive plant, you could also use perceive plant to communicate with a plant, just as you could with an animal. Mentalist is mind, it's telepathy. So if you do control mind, control mentalist, you're manipulating something's mind. If you do perceive mind, you're doing detect thoughts. If you do destroy mind, you're trying to mentally shatter somebody. And in the case of that, if you're trying to destroy somebody's mind, what I would say is the system is structured for that creativity. And there's the carve out I wanted to bring up is you can do damage to focus and gravitas with mentalist and soul. So if you do a spell attack with destroy mentalist or destroy soul at a target, or you come up with a flavorful way to do it with one of these other ones, I don't really think create would make sense. Nor perceive. Perceive isn't supposed to be doing damage. But change, control, and destroy, I could all see creative arguments for, which is kind of the whole point of the system, is we've played games with buttons where you push the button, it does the thing. We've been there, done that. We don't need to rehash the same game 30 trillion times. So I'm saying defaults destroy, but I'm sure people can come up with creative ways for how change and control could make sense. Anyways, when you're doing a mentalist attack on somebody, same thing as with everything that's been hitting endurance, your damage to the resource is equal to your perception rating, or in this case, your persona rating, since mentalist and soul are both persona skills, or persona proficiencies. So if your persona rating was 6, you do destroy a mentalist on somebody, then their focus would go down by 6 if you hit them with the attack. And then if this was a wounding type attack where you could mentally shatter someone, then if you get a crit, then you'd be rolling your total pool penetration against their mental defense. And then for soul deals damage to gravitas, and same thing, it would go against mental as well for kind of destroying somebody's soul, rendering them kind of a husk. And there we go. That we didn't cover threat. The last thing is threat. In the turn order, if you get an odd, for any check that rolls an odd, if the GM doesn't want to do anything, they gain a threat. And this is a way that, just as the players have an advantage pool that represents their rested and like preparations for a long trip to go do something, threat is the consequences of that adventure forming as a meta currency for the GM to use against the players later. So every check has the potential drawback of being an odd roll generating threat for the GM. And that should not dissuade players from making checks, but it should prevent, or at least provide a way to counteract excessive checks from players trying to fish for something. You know, if everybody just wants to, so really one person in the group should be making a check for the entire group for whatever it is that is happening. Because one of the frustrating things for me as a GM is when I call for a check, and the way the system is designed is that everyone's supposed to make their own version of that check. And then I have to go through and look through like 5 or 6 different results and see, okay, what happened? What's the adjudication for this person, and this person, and that person failed, but this person succeeded. And so that person succeeded. They're probably going to tell the whole group what happened anyways. So the juice, in my opinion, isn't worth the squeeze on other people making a duplicate check. And Gravitas fits nicely into covering for that. So if any player is saying, oh, well, but it's not fair, I could have made that check if I had rolled it. But you don't need to, because you're going to spend Gravitas to boost the person so that they pass, as the game is designed for you to do. So every check matters. Every check can make the GM stronger for that session. The GM can use threat. They can introduce something new. And honestly, there's no point rehashing threat. Threat, basically anything that the GM can do in Dungeon World, when the GM gets a move, threat can basically be used to do the same thing. I'm not going to rehash that whole thing here. But probably the most common thing GMs are going to be using threat for is to cause NPCs to act. So I haven't gotten to NPC design yet, but I've run Daggerheart, and kind of the same thing is that threat NPCs will have their own list of regular things that they can do to pose an obstacle to players. But you can power NPCs up by spending threat to trigger very powerful abilities that would be broken if the NPC could do it without a cost. And so sure, whatever it is you have, they could do their powerful move consecutively multiple rounds in a row if you have the threat to fuel that. But there is a cost to it, and eventually your threat will run out, and you'll have to cool it on those powerful abilities. And that every time the GM uses one of those, it's an opportunity cost of them not using another cool trick that a different creature has. So you should spend this. You shouldn't be burning every single threat every single round to, hammer the PCs into oblivion. Use it to raise the tension. By all means, use threat during a boss fight. Spend all of it, because that's boss fights should be the time where you burn your threat. And if you really want to style with it, save it until the boss is almost dead. Not almost, but after the boss has been beat up a bit, so it has sort of a rage mode, and then you just start burning threat constantly. Anyways, I think that'll cover it for now. I always end up making videos way longer than I intend to, and it doesn't even seem like we talked about that much, but I hope this helps explain the Google Doc.